I'm Lisa Falk. I'm head of community engagement for the museum, and I'll serve as your host this evening. As most of you know, Arizona State Museum is part of the University of Arizona. We're located in Tucson. We're situated on land that has been stewarded by and home to indigenous peoples for 13,000 years. Today, the Tucson area is home to the O'odham and the Pasco Yaqui, and there are 22 federally recognized tribes with reservation lands in the state of Arizona. The museum's collections and research focus on the indigenous peoples of the Southwest and Northwest Mexico, and we present programs exploring the history and cultures of this region. This year's Zoom talks are in association with our exhibit, Wrapped in Color, Legacies of the Mexican Sarape. So at this point, I'm happy to welcome Dr. Marc Levine. Dr. Levine serves as Associate Curator of Archaeology at the Sam Noble Museum and also as Associate Professor of Anthropology, both at the University of Oklahoma. His research focuses on the archaeology of Mesoamerica and especially the southern Mexican state of Oaxaca. Most recently, he directed field work at the UNESCO World Heritage Site of Monte Albn. He is investigating the changing role and meaning of the site's main plaza through time. A digital visualization component of the project includes 3D models and a virtual reality rendering of the main plaza. Dr. Levine also has a long-term research project at the late classic period capital site of Totultepec, located at the southern coast of Oaxaca. Dr. Levine has shared his research insights through many scholarly articles.
Thank you for the invitation. I'm really pleased to be here tonight. The title of my talk today is New Discoveries at Monte Albn, Buried Buildings and Political Transformation at the Zapotec capital. I want to begin by getting you oriented to the site. I saw already many of you in the chat mention that you've been to Oaxaca, so we can do this relatively quickly. But for those who haven't, Oaxaca is a southern state in Mexico, and it's a very diverse place ethno-linguistically, ecologically, environmentally. And the area that we're interested in today is in the highland region in central Oaxaca. Now, Monte Albn is an archaeological site today located at the center of the Valley of Oaxaca, which is shaped like a Y upside down. So Monte Albn is found at the intersection point between these three valleys. The Valley of Oaxaca is found at an elevation of a bit over 5,000 feet, and it provides a really large area that's suitable for agriculture, and there were populations living here for essentially 10,000 years, Paleo-Indian peoples. This gives you a better idea of the more precise location of Monte Albn. It's located on a series of hills at the center of the valley. And so what you're seeing here in the foreground is the civic ceremonial center of the site on top of a 300-meter high hill that's within this larger valley. So in the background, you're seeing urban settlement of modern Oaxaca, and then further on, you're seeing the mountains that are at the edges of the Valley of Oaxaca. So what you're seeing here is the civic ceremonial core, and today the site is protected from urban sprawl, and so it's quite forested on its slopes here. But in antiquity, there would have been different neighborhoods, residential terraces here covering it, lots of activity. Here's another shot of the main plaza, which is our focus today. And as you can see, it's a large rectangular area, and it measures about 300 meters by 150 meters. By our own measurements, it's a bit over 45,000 square meters, which is about 8.5 football fields that could fit in there, to give you a better idea. Hopefully you can see from this slide, which was taken with our drone, that it's really a spectacular location with commanding views of different parts of the valley on all sides, and it's quite beautiful. It's a point of great pride in Mexico, and in fact, you can find a picture of Monte Albn's main plaza on the back of the 20 peso note. Estimates are that, in a non-pandemic year, there's as many as 400,000 tourists that visit the site from all over the world. And not only does this attract the attention of many visitors, but archaeologists as well. And this is because of spectacular, rich archaeological record. Not only this monumental core, but incredible tombs with polychrome murals. It's also home to the largest corpus of carved stone monuments in Oaxaca, many of which are bearing Zapotec script, which is one of the important independent writing systems that was devised in Mesoamerica in antiquity. So archaeologists have been working here for now just over a century. And this work is also summarized here. I've showed you the place, now I want to show you the time. Here's the chronology for Monte Albn. The site was founded, as best we know, at about 500 BCE and had a long and successful run as a regional capital until about 750 or 800 of the Common Era, when there was a political collapse at the site and it ceases to be a regional power at that time. I want to draw your attention to another important period, and this is at about 100 BCE, between Monte Albn period 1 and period 2, or the Pei and Nisa phases. And this is when I'm going to argue that there's evidence for a significant political crisis at the site that really rocked it and led to some big changes in the main plaza, such that everything before this political crisis around 100 BCE, I'm going to talk about as the early plaza, and everything after 100 BCE, I'll refer to as the late plaza. So why this great interest in Monte Albn's main plaza? Well, there are many reasons, but quickly, although there's been a great deal of research at Monte Albn over time, we know very little about the early plaza. That means that most of what you're seeing here corresponds to the late plaza. So there are several buildings here that are on the margins of this large rectangular area. And then there's a central building, a set of buildings that act sort of as a central spine here. All these central spine buildings date to the late plaza, after period 2, after 100 BCE. And that's also true of this row of buildings, the southern platform. And many of these buildings are enlarged to a great deal. So the Monte Albn's plaza that we see today is the late plaza, not the early plaza. So we want to know what it looked like in its earliest days. Now, for a long time, archaeologists have argued that, well, there are some remnants of the early plaza that archaeologists have found deeply beneath and within many of these structures. But the idea was that, well, you know, we found little pieces here and there, but we can't really piece it together. And because of conservation reasons, we're probably not going to be able to do any tunneling program at Monte Albn anytime soon. And so the thinking was that all of the early plaza features were buried beneath later buildings. And so they were out of reach. And essentially, we didn't really have any hope of understanding the early plaza. And as I had visited the site and thought about this, you know, looking at this large, expansive plaza, I began to think about, well, maybe it's possible that some remnants of the early plaza may be just beneath these open plaza areas. Now, this is because in Mesoamerica, it's not uncommon for there to be renovations, additions, and shifts in the layout in a ceremonial center like this. So I also was influenced by some of my colleagues, Scott Hammerstedt and Amanda Rainier at the Oklahoma Archaeological Survey. They had been using geophysical prospection at an important site in Oklahoma called Spiro Mounds. And they've been having a lot of success with that. And these are non-invasive ways of seeing beneath the surface of the ground for archaeological features. And I showed them a picture of Monte Albn and I said, would you ever be interested in working on the plaza here? And do you think that we would have any potential for discovery? And they said, yes. And in fact, the plaza looks like it would be very pleasant to work on. It's nice and flat, has short grass. There are not a lot of obstacles that would get in the way. So we kind of hatched a plan to go work at Monte Albn and see what we could find. So the objectives are really quite clear. We wanted to see if we could find pre-Hispanic features beneath the plaza. Now, to do this, we assembled not one, not two, but three different methodologies. And we did this because it allows us to have independent lines of evidence to check one with another. And it's really helpful to have different methodologies when you're doing geophysics to corroborate what you see in one with another. So I won't talk too much about these, but the gradiometer is a passive sensor that uses magnetism. The electrical resistance apparatus that you see here has 3 stakes that go into the ground. This is an active sensor that uses an electric current that goes through the ground. And then we had 2 different varieties of ground penetrating radar, a high and a low megahertz variety that we used. And we did our work in June and July during the start of the rainy season. That's why everything looks so green. And it turns out that this was very beneficial, especially for the electrical resistance, which seems to have performed at a higher level because there was some moisture in the ground, and this improved things. So we wanted to see what pre-Hispanic features we could identify beneath the plaza's surface. And we wanted to do this because we're interested in the early plaza. And we're interested in the early plaza because many of the key debates and arguments about Monte Albán's founding, why was it founded, when it was founded, what was the role of warfare, what was the role of religion in its establishment. Many of these arguments rely on our perception or our understanding of what the early plaza was like in these early centuries. So we were hoping that we would get some evidence that would tell us something about the layout, form, function, and meaning of the early plaza. Now, parenthetically, apart from the geophysical prospection work, we also embarked on a digital mapping project that included a total station, but also included aerial photogrammetry that was aided with a drone. You can see down here, this is the drone that we used. And on the right, you're seeing a topographic map of the surface of the plaza, but you're also seeing a map of the surrounding architecture that we did using aerial photogrammetry. And I won't be talking too much about this today, but one of the benefits of aerial photogrammetry is it allowed us to create a series of 3D maps of the site, including individual structures. And this facilitated a study of volume, which tells us something about the labor investment and something about the scale of the city. So that's been quite useful. Excuse me. So getting to our results, the geophysical survey was quite successful. We found hundreds of anomalies, but then what we needed to do was start to parse out those anomalies that appeared to be pre-Hispanic features versus those that might be natural, something like bedrock, or historic anomalies, something like an excavation pit that may be from the 1930s that perhaps we lost track of or was never recorded very well. The next thing that we wanted to do is, of those pre-Hispanic features, we wanted to identify them in terms of type or function to tell us something more than just that there's something beneath the surface. So I'm going to begin with the gradiometer results. This is the one that's relying on magnetism. And I didn't say this before, but using these different methodologies, they all have different strengths in terms of what they're good at finding, in terms of buried features and the attributes that they have. They also work better in different conditions. So the gradiometer, at the outset, we didn't know how it was going to perform at Monte Albn, so we were surprised that it really gave us some good information. So on the left, what you're seeing is a drone photo in plan view looking down on the main plaza. At the center, you're seeing that central spine of buildings G, H, I, and J over here. Now, the geophysical prospection is only working in the open areas. We didn't do it over the building. So these white areas are where we snipped out the buildings. So all the buildings have corresponding letters at Monte Albn. This small structure here is called the adoratorio, or we call it the adoratorio cistern. And that's also snipped out here on your right. So Immediately, when we looked at the gradiometer results, this square here really stuck out to us. And to give you an idea of the scale, each one of these squares is 20 by 20 meters. Let's look at that a little bit more closely. We're calling this anomaly A, and we were pretty excited to find this because we knew it wasn't a natural anomaly given its shape. And also it didn't look like a historic one. This is not the size of a normal excavation pit. It's 18 by 18 meters in size. And what we're seeing are two concentric squares. And we think that these represent an inner and an outer wall, kind of like a core and veneer wall, with an interior that's filled with fill or rubble. Now, this darker black area is showing evidence of disturbance. And this could be disturbed soil, or it could be showing higher magnetism because it's burned. In addition, we're seeing a bunch of little pockets of interior anomalies here that could be, subfloor pits. So in addition, on the eastern part, we're seeing a linear feature that is, right in the center and somewhat perpendicular as well. So it looks like this is something associated with anomaly A. It's very enigmatic. We don't know what it is. It could be a pathway of some sort, or a corridor, or a tunnel. We really don't know at this point. And like many of the things that we're looking at, we can come up with some ideas, but eventually limited excavations will be the best way to confirm some of the hypotheses that we have. Now, on the eastern part of the plaza, we also identified a second square structure. This one was considerably smaller, about 8 by 8 meters. And that was just north of the adoratorio. And to the south of the adoratorio, we have a lot of disturbance here. These black and white splotches indicate that there must be some metal. And it's probably something heavy like rebar that was entered into the site at some point, probably through excavations or reconstruction activities at the site. And when there's metal like this, it completely blows out the gradiometer results. So we're not sure what's located there. But very quickly, we have some unusual and enigmatic features located somewhat equidistant north and south of anomaly A. And to this day, we really have no idea what these are. They're too big to be burials. Sometimes we call them the crow's feet. They look kind of comet shaped, but these two clusters are really odd. Maybe they're people that have ideas out there. Excuse me. Now, when we got the electrical resistance results, this provided really great corroboration that indeed, as you can see here, we have a large square feature that was not a figment of our imagination, but is actually there, something buried beneath the plaza. This is what it looks like today. Okay, there's actually a little bit of a difference in the vegetation on the surface that indicates that along the wall lines, there's less grass growing, probably because there's less moisture retention there. But let's look a little bit more closely. So here we're seeing anomaly A, and good confirmation that, again, we've got what looks to us like a structure, a square structure, 18 by 18 meters. But the resistance data is also telling us some new things that weren't picked up by the gradiometer. And this includes these two circles located, well centered here on the eastern side. And we believe these to be columns that are probably flanking a doorway. And I'll tell you more about that in a moment. But we also have these 5 squares. Now, these 5 squares are also quite strange. There are 2 small ones on each side that are 4 by 4 meters in size. And the central one, which is well centered with anomaly A, is about 6 by 6 meters. These are somewhat similar in size to what we would expect maybe of an altar found at Monte Albn. But typically altars are found by themselves and usually centered in a patio. They're not lined up in this fashion. However, these are from an earlier era, and it's possible that they could be using altars in a different way. One of the other ideas that we have is that perhaps these could be cysts or stone boxes of some sort. Now, the stone boxes that you're seeing at your right were found at Monte Albn near the south platform, and they were essentially boxes containing offerings like pottery, jade, shell, and other items. These were dedicatory offerings to the south platform. And what you're seeing here with the resistance data is this lighter color means there's lower resistance to the electrical current. We think that the sediments within this area are moist and the water is making them more conductive. And this is a guess that we have, again, somewhat speculative, but what's not so speculative is that these 5 boxes are aligned with anomaly A. There's spatial patterning here that suggests that they are related and they're part and associated with that building. So that's really intriguing to us. Interestingly, the resistance data didn't show us any evidence of that possible passageway. That's something that's different. Now, on the eastern side of the plaza, we picked up anomaly B quite well. And just to the south, we picked up another called anomaly C. And these are somewhat equidistant to the north and the south of the adoratorio. And their alignment seems to match up quite well with the other anomalies that we described from the western part of the plaza. Now, these anomalies B and C are roughly 6 by 6 meters. Again, they could be altars or they could be structures. We really don't have a very good explanation for those right now. However, it does look like they may very well be associated with the others, just on the other side there. Now, our third line of evidence comes from ground penetrating radar. And it was really great to have the GPR data because, again, it confirmed the form and size of anomaly A, shows these 2 concentric square walls. And also, this is really nice that it showed us what we think are these 2 columns that are flanking the eastern exterior of the building. Now, these 5 boxes didn't all show up, but there is some evidence for a few of them. One of the great things about the ground penetrating radar is it gives us more detailed depth information that the others don't provide. I'll talk about that in a moment. So summarizing the information that we have, we've got a big square building that is 18 by 18 meters, significant in size. Beneath the plaza, no one has any, people just walk over it every day and have no idea it's there. We've got relatively thick double walls that are 1.5 to 2 meters thick. We think this thickness is because, remember, we're looking down on this feature in plan view. And so I think that the outline of the square actually records the outline of a large square platform. And so the thick walls may be helping to buttress what may be a considerable amount of fill on the interior that may be pushing outwards. Now, the depth of anomaly A is the top of the walls are only 20 centimeters below the present day plaza surface. But it seems that anomaly A and that building is actually sitting on a surface 120 centimeters below the present plaza surface. So we know that the present plaza surface was constructed in period 2 sometime around 100 BCE or after that. So the building must predate that. It's possible that it's very early in period 2, but it's most likely that it dates to period 1. So what we're looking at is the possibility that this is a building that comes from the earliest centuries of Monte Albn's history. Now, to give you an idea of the scale of this building and to remind you what it looks like, I had the opportunity to be in Monte Albn with some of my students, and I had them stand around the perimeter of this building. And this really gives you an idea that this was a massive building right in the center of the main plaza. So it's would have been quite impressive. Now, in looking at the attributes of anomaly A, more and more we started to narrow down to the conclusion that we think that it's a temple. And one of the really strong diagnostic features were what we believe to be these columns. And that's because there are over 10 temples known from Monte Albn. Most of them are from later periods, but all of them have columns. So if they're columns, this is a diagnostic feature of temples. Now, going beyond that, if we're right that these are columns, then columns in temples always flank entryways. And this would mean that anomaly A, if it is a temple, is facing east. Now that would also fit well with many of the temples on the main plaza that also face east. And we think that this may have had, was because people were interested in solar observation, which makes a lot of sense. From the doorstep, they may have been able to look and watch the movement of the rising of the sun as it moved along the horizon during the year. And we know from Mesoamerican worldview and interesting calendrics and celestial phenomena that solar observations were very important and of great interest. Now, we also have some representations of temples from the site, from carved stone monuments, also these maquetas, which are interesting models of temples that have been found. All of these show evidence for columns that fit what we have, and also substantial platforms upon which these temples fit. So everything to us is pointing that this was a temple. And if you're interested, we recently published a more complete argument about why we think this is a temple in Latin American antiquity. So, okay, we think we found a temple, but what does this mean? What are the ramifications of this for Monte Albn and its history? Well, first I want to go a little bit further and say, not only do we think we found a temple, but we think we found what could be a temple precinct, one of the earliest temple precincts at Monte Albn. We're calling this the PGMA complex. As I said before, we think that they're associated with one another because they share a similar orientation. They seem to align with one another. They seem to also be at a similar location in the central area. We didn't find buildings down here or down here. They all are in the central cluster. In addition, the ground penetrating radar information tells us they're all located at a similar depth beneath the plaza. So this suggests to us that they're contemporaneous. Now, I also want to talk about what this means historically. Now, all of these are now buried and you can't see them. They're buried beneath over 1.2 meters of fill. Now, this means that at some point there was a change in politics at Monte Albn where something at this temple was no longer palatable to the rulers, and they decided to tear it down, to bury it, and not to memorialize it in any other way, in any way at all. This is a form of architectural erasure where they wanted no memory of this. They wanted to have a fresh start. And to me, this seems to be evidence of some sort of political crisis. And this is just one line of evidence, and I want to present other lines of evidence for you. Another line of evidence comes from this famous building called Building L Sub, which is home to the Donsantes, these carved stones depicting individuals that have many different interpretations about them. It's very controversial. But what's not controversial is that around 100 BCE, the powers that be at Monte Albn decided to systematically dismantle this elaborate carved stone tableau embedded into the facade of Building L. It included over 300 carved Donsantes, and many of these were taken down and removed and reused in different parts of the site as foundation stones or door jambs, other mundane uses. And the remaining stones were completely bricked over in a way that really nobody could really read or see any of this iconography or writing associated with the Donsantes. So this suggests another break with the past around 100 BCE. In addition, we have a really significant change in writing and expression. As I said, the largest corpus of Zapotec writing is at Monte Albn. And there's evidence for a really clear shift in the kind of writing and art and the content and how it is used at Monte Albn. We go from something that looks like this with the Donsantes to something that looks like this, composite glyphs put together. This comes from Building J, a different building at the site. And even without getting into the content and meaning of these, even a novice can see that there's just a very different way of using writing at this time that suggests a big shift in content and what the powers that be, the rulers and nobles, were trying to say about themselves. Additional evidence for this crisis comes from demographic information. There were really important surveys done at Monte Albn by Richard Blanton and in the Valley of Oaxaca by Blanton and his colleagues. And in both the instances, they find evidence for a significant drop in population at this time, over 16% drop at Monte Albn and nearly 20% in the Valley of Oaxaca. And this is just not what you would expect for a thriving capital. Instead, it suggests that there's some kind of disruption. Perhaps there's out-migration, people are leaving, voting with their feet, if you will, or perhaps fissioning, maybe a group left the region. We don't really know, but it does suggest some disruption. Now, in addition, it's at this time that we also see the erection of a substantial defensive wall around the exposed parts of Monte Albn on its northwest, and western flanks. And there are different interpretations to this, but I think the most acceptable one is that it indicates some measure of instability, insecurity at the site, or perhaps conflict or even violence. And we don't know if this is coming from internal factions at Monte Albn or perhaps from the outside. But in a general way, it seems to point to a political crisis. Well, whatever the causes for this political crisis, what we do know is that there was a remarkable rebound at Monte Albn. So Anomaly A and the temple and the other associated buildings from the PGMA complex, they were razed, they were deliberately buried, but then the plaza surface was elevated over 1 meter in height, and the plaza was reformulated as a large rectangular open space. And then the rulers went on a huge building spree that included buildings G, H, I, and J, the southern platform, many of the buildings that are located on the eastern side. But it seems that this new layout and the new buildings, this was a successful building program, and it speaks to the power of those rulers and their ability to reach consensus and negotiate with kind of regular people that were the laborers and the ones who bought into this idea of a bigger, more magnificent and spectacular civic ceremonial center. So this is important because it shows that Monte Albn didn't just grow through time, going, for instance, in an evolutionary sequence from a chiefdom to a state to an empire without any hiccups along the way. Monte Albn had history, and it wasn't always smooth going. There was, in some points, there's 2 steps forward and 1 step back. And I think that around 100 BCE is when we see this difficult imbrication point where there is a political crisis, but ultimately this propels Monte Albn to success that it had never seen before. Now, moving on, I want to also talk a little bit about some of the implications of our work and what we've shown. And I think in some ways it helps us to dispel some misconceptions about Monte Albn's main plaza. Some of these are that Monte Albn's plaza is part of a master plan that unfolded over 10 centuries, and that it was preconceived from the outset. And our work clearly shows that that's not the case, that's not the case. And this speaks to bigger questions in Mesoamerica about urban planning in pre-Hispanic centers and the degree to which it was planned versus unplanned, what areas were planned, what areas not planned. Right now, there's generally consensus that these civic ceremonial cores were in fact planned. Most people would agree to that. However, there's not so consensus about how they were planned. In other words, what were the primary factors involved? What were the guiding principles? Are they based on cosmology, religion, and ideology? Or could they be more political in nature? Or could they be more practical in nature? Maybe they have something to do with efficiency or logistics and transport. Those are questions that we're still working on. And there's probably a great diversity in Mesoamerica depending on the site. Another argument that we hear often is that, the main plaza at Monte Albn represents an unprecedented labor investment. And our work shows that really it brings that into question. When we made our 3D models based on our aerial photogrammetry, we were able to make estimates that parsed out the early plaza before 100 BCE and the late plaza afterwards. And this is really important because this helps us to understand the initial labor investment associated with Monte Albn's founding. And when we look at that, we find that it's really somewhere around 324,000 cubic meters. That's nothing to sniff at. In the Valley of Oaxaca, it's certainly large, and it's probably bigger than other peer sites, although we don't have really good information from those, but it's bigger, but not on an order of magnitude, we should say. Now, when we pan out even further and look at Mesoamerica, what we find is it really is not very exceptional or unprecedented. Actually, there's a University of Arizona archaeologist, Takeshi Inomata, who's made some really fascinating discoveries in the Gulf Coast region at Aguada Phoenix in particular. And the artificial platform at that site is 10 times the size of the early plaza at Monte Albn. So, the labor effort at Monte Albn is not something so unusual in terms of organization. There are public works of this size and much greater going on in different parts of Mesoamerica. Another argument that we often encounter is that Monte Albn's plaza is completely unique. Now, I'm going to say that this has maybe been exaggerated a little bit. And I think that this is primarily because people making these comparisons are relying on the late plaza. And the late plaza layout is pretty unique if you look at it. But the early plaza layout is not terribly unique. It uses an architectural grammar that's recognizable to us, things like temples, buildings, platforms, and the like. But I don't see it as being terribly unique. However, we can say that its location on a hilltop is somewhat unique. This hilltop at the center of the Valley of Oaxaca was a strategic location, was a defensible location, and is this really just a spectacular location? I think that we can all appreciate that. However, some scholars have said that no capitals were ever established on the top of mountains in the Valley of Oaxaca, and that's simply not true. If we look at San Martin Tilcajete and El Palenque, which is a site that actually predates the establishment of Monte Albn by a century or two, it was also founded on a mountaintop. And it's possible that the founders of Monte Albn got this idea from sites like El Palenque. That's pure speculation right now, but I just want to demonstrate that the idea of putting a site on a mountaintop, this is not an innovation that can fully be attributed to Monte Albn. Now, the flip side of that is some people have argued that Monte Albn's main plaza was completely copied from another area. And again, I think that this is a mistake based on making comparisons with the late plaza and not with the early plaza. So the two of them have completely different layouts in my estimation. And so those comparisons, I think we can throw out. However, a moment ago, I just mentioned this really interesting information coming out of the Gulf Coast region. that's being done by Dr. Inomata and his colleagues that have found dozens and dozens of sites using LiDAR in the greater Gulf Coast region and Chiapas and surrounding areas. And it seems like what they're finding is that there's a site layout at La Venta and other sites like Aguada Phoenix that's being duplicated over and over and over at other sites. We're still trying to digest this information. It was just published in 2021, but I think it raises the possibility again that the site layout at Monte Albn, even for the early plaza, is perhaps influenced or maybe inspired by that in other regions by their peers, contemporaries of the people at Monte Albn. That requires further research. And to be quite honest, our picture of the early plaza at Monte Albn is still incomplete. We don't have such a clear record because still much of the early plaza is obscured by later buildings. So in closing, I want to say that there's a lot of exciting research questions that I think we've uncovered at Monte Albn and have helped to kind of open up new conversations that haven't been happening for a long time. I hope that it's going to cause us researchers and others to question some of the orthodoxies or things that we think we know about Monte Albn that maybe we don't quite know. Not things that go beyond the plaza layout, but also about the timing of the foundation of Monte Albn and the nature of the founding of Monte Albn. So much of our understanding remains unclear. And so I think that what we need is more archaeological data. We need more fieldwork at Monte Albn to test some models that have really been kicked around now for 35, even 45 years without sufficient archaeological data in order to test those ideas through debate and scientific work. So with that, I want to thank the Consejo de Arqueología of the INA that provided permits for our research. And I want to thank the Center INA Oaxaca also for their help and support throughout, and also to acknowledge these other individuals and institutions that supported our work. And with that, I also want to thank you for your attention and now open it up to questions if there are any.
Are there any astronomical alignments at Monte Albn?
Astronomical alignments at Monte Albn. Well, the part of Monte Albn that draws the most attention for this kind of question is Building J. So Building J is an unusual building that is arrow-shaped and points in a southwest direction that does not align with any others. And so many have argued that this may have some sort of alignment that was, aligns to some celestial movements. And Anthony Avini, who's the dean of archaeoastronomy in Mesoamerica and in the Americas, has published on Building J. So I would point you to some of those publications. But I think that none of those alignments have been kind of universally accepted, nor are they super accessible, such that I would remember them off the top of my head. So it seems that there is some order. There's a spatial order, and it's very likely that it's cosmological in nature, that there's some kind of manner of imbuing, a Zapotec worldview into the architecture. We're just really not sure what it's about. There's been some other archaeologists that have argued that there may be numerological associations such that their proportions at Monte Albn and the length of the ball court, for instance, and the length of the plaza, and in different distances that seem to correspond in a way that correspond to ratios in calendrics in the 365-day calendar and the 260-day calendar. So in terms of celestial alignments, though, I'm not really aware of any compelling ones to date.
Okay. Suppose says that your research is very interesting and wants to know, how do archaeologists share the findings with locals in Oaxaca?
Yeah, that's a good question. So how do we share, the research with locals in Oaxaca? One way is to give public lectures. Another way is to publish our work in English and in Spanish. Luckily, we have the opportunity sometimes to publish in Arqueología Mexicana, which is somewhat like National Geographic, but for archaeology in Mexico. The interest in archaeology in Mexico is through the roof. It's far greater than in the United States. And a public-facing magazine like Arqueología Mexicana is at every kind of newspaper stand, and newspaper stands still do exist in Mexico, believe it or not. We also do lectures in community museums. So a lot of my work is located on the coast of Oaxaca at Chapultepec, which is a post-classic site. And there's a public community museum there where we do public lectures to share some of that information. There's also internet. I didn't mention the internet and websites is another way we can reach people. And our website, which I provided the link and maybe it was posted into the chat, it's bilingual in English and Spanish. So that's another way that we can reach people.
I mean, I know these sites date back thousands of years, but I'm curious if there's any, like when you do present it, do people bring up any oral tradition that's been passed down in the Zapotec community related to these sites?
You know what, there is. Yeah, there is some oral tradition, in particular around the site itself. There are some oral traditions that I'm not, there's sort of like a social memory that this is an important place, that this is hallowed ground. In the local community of Jojocotlan, which is nearby, there are actually some written records from the conquest era, from the Spanish Entrada period, where people referred to it as Hill of the Jaguars. So there is like a preservation of an understanding that this was a place of previous people that were powerful people, royal people, nobles, and this kind of thing. But I haven't delved myself so deeply into oral history and its application at Monte Albn. But it's pretty deep into the past. So
have bodies been found there? I mean, are there tombs there and other things that would give you more about the people who occupied that site?
Yes, there's hundreds of tombs actually that have been excavated at Monte Albn, including Tomb 7, which was probably the site and the discovery of Tomb 7 that made Monte Albn world famous back in the 1930s. So yeah, there are a number of archaeologists that are doing bioarchaeology or physical anthropology on the remains of people from Monte Albn in efforts to understand diet, trauma, nutrition, quality of life, questions like that. There's some famous examples of cranial modification at the site, cranial trephination, that perhaps may have been brain surgery in the past. Some people have speculated that it may have been to relieve, tension, or associated with hematomas or injuries or other types of maybe mental health illnesses. We don't really know.
Fascinating. Joe Ashcroft, I don't know what you're referring to. You said maybe an early E-group, but I think he was referring to something you were saying at that point in your talk.
Yeah.
So do you want to comment on that, or should I go on?
Yeah, actually, yeah, that really is an apt comparison. What I'm calling as a temple that we think we found there seems to be facing east, and he seems to be talking about E-groups in the Maya area, which come from this period, and E-groups are used for observations of celestial phenomena, and they're found in many areas of the Maya area. And it's possible that we have something akin to that. If that temple was for solar observation, it may be that in the middle formative period that was really the most important part of ritual practices in that period. Another thing that I didn't speak about so much is that on the eastern part of the plaza, where the adoratorio and the cistern lie, and above and below we found those smaller structures. The cistern, was used for holding water, and we know that water is really important. There's a lot of water rituals that were dedicated to the preservation of this this valued thing that's needed for life. And so there's a possibility that some of these ritual practices incorporated water as well.
Well, I have quite a few more questions, so let me get through them.
I'll be quicker.
No, that's fine. I mean, people are fascinated. Monte Albn is the only site I've visited with a Zenith Passage tube. What is the function significance of Zenith Passage tubes?
Oh boy, yeah, you're really testing me on my archaeoastronomy. I think that you're probably referring to building P. On the main plaza, there's a building that has a shaft that does, at zenith of, when the sun's overhead, it purportedly has this beam of light that goes into the interior of the building. Well, this is very unusual because most of these buildings don't have a whole lot of interior space within them. Some of them do. Some of them have tunnels that were utilized in the pre-Hispanic era, but typically they don't. Now that building is actually in the vicinity of the buildings that we found buried. It's not far from the adoratorio. It's just to the east of the adoratorio. Now, my understanding is that that shaft where the sun passes through has been brought into question, that it may be an artifact of reconstructions, and that may not actually be a pre-Hispanic feature, but that's been debated. But some of my colleagues who I've spoken to think that perhaps it's not really a pre-Hispanic feature.
So I have a couple about the materials of the plaza. One says, when you talk about the amount of material moved, is that what was removed to make it flat? And for the extension of the later plaza, was material removed from a large area used to cover the early plaza? I was wondering about that too. And then somebody else asked, was the plaza ever paved or plastered?
Okay, great questions. First of all, when people established this new center, what we think is that they began by flattening a broad area of this hilltop. It wasn't naturally flat. And by looking at bedrock outcrops in the region, what we think is that there was a series of kind of undulating pieces of bedrock there. And we think that they kind of cut some of the top parts and used that to fill the low parts. So using our ground penetrating radar, one of the research questions that we looked at was to try to define the bedrock beneath the plaza. And so we did do that in a bunch of different areas, and we found that indeed the bedrock is of different heights in different areas, and that there's artificial fill that was put in there. So we use that as part of our estimates of the total volume of the plaza surface itself. So to re-explain, the buried building that we found was originally sitting on a plaza surface that was 1.2 meters below the one that we see today. So what we think is that building was kind of destroyed, the superstructure, but the platform it was sitting on remains, and that's what we're seeing. And then they took fill, dirt, from we don't know where, and used it to fill that in. But not just fill that, they filled the entire surface another 1 meter higher. So that's a significant input of additional fill. And then they did plaster the surface in period 2. And we think it was white plaster. A lot of that was destroyed by farming that, believe it or not, people were farming up on Monte Albn's main plaza back in the 1920s. And that tore up a lot of the stucco, but we still see remnants of stucco along the edges of the plaza where it was preserved.
How many people do you think lived there during its heyday?
Yeah, so that's a great question. How many people lived at Monte Albn? I've been making this distinction between early Monte Albn and late Monte Albn throughout. So I think it's, the early plaza itself in that period one, there's probably maybe 7,000 people at Monte Albn, but at its height several centuries later, we think it was between 15 and 30,000 people. Now there's, we have to provide this margin of error because there are a lot of assumptions built in. The population estimates are based on counts of domestic residences, and then based on assumptions of like how big were their families, how many people live there. Demographic analogy, looking at historic cases of people living in domestic residences that look something like that, and how many people would live there if it was a nuclear family, an extended family, and so on and so forth.
It's a lot of people, nevertheless. There's another one about the closets. It's beyond the rectangular area that you have examined. Does it appear that there's a broader area also covered over at about the same time? So you were saying they did fill in the whole area, right?
Yeah, we're really focusing on this civic ceremonial core, and that's really well hemmed in by the architecture. And so if you're asking about what's going on, on the slopes in the neighborhoods, the residential areas, we'd love to know more about those. There needs to be more excavations out there, but if there was filling in out there, it would have been for a different purpose altogether. That would be to be creating flat residential terraces so that they could live on those slopes and probably have maybe orchards or gardens interspersed among them.
So somebody was wondering, is there any consideration to excavate the buried features you discovered within them?
Yes, yeah, we're hoping to do limited excavations at some point in the future. It really wouldn't take very much work to get some really good information. Like I said, the tops of those anomalies, the tops of the big temple is only 20 centimeters below the surface. That's where we think we're seeing the uppermost parts of the remnants of those walls. What we'd like to do is a couple limited excavations, get some, carbon that we could do radiocarbon dating on, get some ceramics that could help us with dating, and maybe look at some features in the interior, look at some of those features that we think are the columns, and verify are those the remnants of column footings, which is what we think they are. Is there any evidence for a stairway? Can we verify that it's indeed facing east? So I don't think it would take very much in order to date it and to confirm the function of the building.
And what would it take to have those excavations start?
To start those excavations, you would need permission from the Consejo de Arqueología, from the Institute, the National Institute of Anthropology and History, to get permission. And, frankly, the site is very delicate. It is a big tourist destination. It's also been subject to a lot of earthquakes. And in fact, right after our project in 2017, we did a systematic recording of the site with our aerial photogrammetry. And, about a month later, there was a major earthquake. This is a very tectonically active area of Mexico. And there was a considerable amount of damage to the architecture at the site. And right now there's a large scale project that is committed to shoring up these walls and buildings that had slumped and fallen in place. And right now we haven't been able to get permission to go back in and do this work, but we're hoping, at some point down the line, we'll be able to return.
Okay, so another one. Given the overlap of the time periods of Monte Albn and the Mayas, is it possible that the Zapotecs were part of the Mayan civilization?
Yes and no. That's a great question. Are they part of the Maya civilization? It just kind of depends on what you mean. If we were to talk about this broader region as a civilization, and I think that would be okay, yeah, we would say they're a part of it, but it's not that one that's part of another. It's that they're part of a larger group of peoples that share many ideas and worldview in common, while also having distinct languages and distinct ritual traditions, religious practices, in the same way, that maybe people from France and Italy and Greece kind of have different ideas about how to do things. But they are contemporaneous. We know that they communicated with one another. We know that they were trading to a certain extent with one another. Know that, for instance, they both played the ball game, perhaps different versions of the ball game. We know that they had similar ideas about sacrifice. They had similar calendars, but they have different writing systems. So I hope that helps to address that they're definitely connected, but they are distinct.
And the last question is, thanks for the interesting talk. I'll be in Oaxaca soon. Is there any evidence of your early plaza discoveries, even just subtle hints that I can see when I'm at Monte Albn? And this isn't mine. I didn't plant this.
Yeah, that's a great question. You're going to see absolutely nothing when you go there, which is part of the wonder, is that it's basically hidden in clear view. If you're on the eastern part of the plaza, you can look to the north and south of the adoratorio, which you'll see, but you won't see anything suggesting that there's something underneath. Now, in the western part of the plaza, I showed you a drone photo that showed kind of a discoloration, like on a general square, where there's kind of a possibility that there's less grass growing on the tops of where those very thick 1.5 to 2 meter walls are. But I don't think that you're going to see that because you're going in the dry season in the winter. The grass isn't going to be a brilliant emerald green like in those pictures. It's more likely to be kind of brown or yellow. So I don't think that you'll see any sign whatsoever.
And your last comment beforehand, somebody else has a question. They said, could there have been an earthquake that could have affected the site between your early and your later periods?
Yeah, that's a really creative idea, and it is a possibility. We do need to think about processes we see in the present acting in the past. And in the same way that an earthquake in 2017 really disrupted the site, closed part of the site, and led to collapses, we have to think that Zapotec also found ways to deal with earthquakes, and probably architecture was quite resistant. But in many cases, there may have been some sort of earthquake there that may have led to some of the renovations. But I think that there's a lot of evidence from different areas that seem to kind of align that there's something happening politically at the site. Could an earthquake be connected? Sure, they're not mutually exclusive. And perhaps, there's a way to find archaeological evidence of an earthquake, but I think it would be tricky. We would need to think about to test that idea. But yeah, I appreciate that question.
So another question just popped up. What do you think the squiggly octopus-like anomalies north and south of anomaly A are?
I have.
If you need to bring your slide up, you can.
No, yeah, those are the ones that I mentioned that to me, they kind of look like a crow's foot.
Oh, that is right.
Or maybe comet shaped. And initially I thought, oh, maybe these are burials of some sort, but they're far too large to be burials. And also they didn't show up in the resistance data for some reason. So we're not sure if they could be some sort of natural feature. We're really stumped on those. We don't know. And I would love to put a test pit in there to just quickly kind of dig a hole and find out what they may be, because we really don't know. They're very enigmatic. They're intriguing. But that's where we're at with those.
Well, I have one last question from me, since I'm going to be in Oaxaca next week. Where can you see those artifacts that you showed on your second slide? All those beautiful items.
Yeah, the Museo de las Culturas de Oaxaca, which is the regional museum of Oaxaca, and is housed in the ex-convent of Santo Domingo, is located right in the core and the center of the city. That has the most spectacular artifacts from Monte Albn, including the so-called Tesoro de Monte Albn, the treasure of Tomb 7, is in an entire room that you just can't miss. It includes hundreds of incredible pieces of gold jewelry made through lost wax casting. They really have to be seen to be believed. They are so intricate and wonderful. but you'll also see pottery there. At Monte Albn, there's also a small site museum that also includes materials from the site. And so those are your best bets for seeing.
Where was that gold being mined?
That's a good question. Where's the gold being mined? Probably from placer deposits in the mountains of Oaxaca. So taken out of rivers is our best bet. We don't have any evidence for large scale mining in Oaxaca, and efforts to source the metals have been frustrating because we think that they're from many places and that those can mix. And sometimes the metallurgists may have mixed those metals as well, but we think they're from river deposits.
Thank you so much. This has been really fascinating. I can't wait to get down there and go visit in person. And thank you so much, Dr. Levine. Learned a lot. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.